So getting back to this concept of influence, right? We know that power is important in being able to influence others. And so you can see how position power or personal power can really have an impact on the different influencing style that we might use. So assertive power and reward and punishment power, right? Using logic, using reward and punishment are pushing strategies where we push people to behave in a particular way. Most of the time, the bread and butter of the business world is really persuasive power, using facts, logic, reasoning, laying things out for people in a systematic way so that they can interpret it and hopefully buy into your interpretation of the way things are going. Reward and punishment is also part of that bread and butter of the business world where we say, do this or I will punish you. And so if people behave in a certain way, you get the reward. If they don't, then they get the consequence. And so that if-then consequence is a big part of influencing in organizations. But what we've learned over time, the if-then reward systems, if you do this, you get this reward, they don't always work really well when you're dealing with people who are doing high-level intellectual work and you want them to be more creative and to use higher-level cognitive thinking to do work. If-then rewards don't work with upper-level people, with more senior people, particularly any kind of job that requires people to be more creative, as I said, and use more intellectual power. And so we have to be careful about this idea of reward and punishment and using this. This shouldn't be our go-to. This should be our last resort, in my mind. In terms of the pulling strategies, these are the things that pull people towards you. You're not ordering them to do it. You're not pushing them to do it in any way. You're trying to influence them and lure them to engage in the behaviors that you want. So we do this by participation and trust, getting their buy-in, hearing their voice, building a trusting relationship with others, creating a common vision, making sure we're all on the same page about what it is that we want to accomplish, and then pulling people together that way. So these are the 4 basic styles. Now, after we talk about styles, we're going to talk about different tactics. And it's important that we recognize the difference between style and tactic. I may have a very participative approach, a style. But I might use tactics sometimes that seem like in contrast to that. So your style is sort of your general strategy. Generally I'm looking to get people to participate and to trust me and to work together to do that. But there are times you may have to use tactics that are not in alignment with that in order to get people in line, and then you can work towards participation and trust. And we see this with negotiation as well. We can want to be more integrative in our negotiation style, but ultimately in the end, sometimes we have to sort of play act a role that we are trying to do in order to get people to buy into where we want to go. And so tactics and styles are challenging there are things that have to be scripted. You have to know in advance what it is that you're going to try to do and work through the script, even if it's a script that you've written in your mind, how you want to influence someone. Sometimes you want to start out really harsh to get someone's attention, and then ultimately in the end you become participative and embracing others and creating that common vision, and everybody's on board and they feel really good at the end. So influencing is a multifaceted approach, and there's not one right way to influence. There's not one solution, one best way to do it. It's all context specific, depending on the people, depending on the problem and the issue that you're trying to influence about. In terms of the different types of tactics, you will see some overlaps between some of the styles that we talked about and then some of these tactics. And remember, as I said, these things are not always in alignment. There are times when you'll use pushing tactics when you really are trying to do a pulling style, and vice versa. And it's about deciding what your audience needs in order to be able to convince them to engage in the behaviors that you want. let's start with the first one here, rational persuasion. And again, you, with rational persuasion, what you're trying to do is lay out all the details, all the facts, all the logical arguments, and you're trying to create a logical, step-by-step case for why someone should do something. The challenge that you're going to run into is if you assume that just because it's logical to you, it means it'll be logical to other people. And that's not always the case. Just because something makes sense to you doesn't mean it makes sense to other people, because you may have some fundamental assumptions that are very different. So we think about this in terms of politics, right? The left tries to convince the right tries to convince the left, but what we have to recognize is that the fundamental assumptions of the left and the fundamental assumptions of the right are incredibly different. So just having a conversation saying, how could you possibly do that? Well, you can if your assumptions are X. And it's very hard to convince someone or persuade someone with a logical argument when their fundamental assumptions are very different than your own. So keep that in mind as you're thinking about that, even in your own personal life. Trying to influence and have a discussion with someone else, you need to make sure you all agree on the baseline assumptions and then proceed from there. Inspirational appeals. Again, we make a request that arouses their enthusiasm. We think about values and ideals and aspirations. This is much more of a more personalized approach, where we're trying to find common ground and common vision and common values and appealing to that. And that can work really well when you have a good relationship with someone. Ingratiation, where we use praise and flattery to get what you want. It's like, hey, you know, you're my BFF and I need your help. Can you please do this for me? And so you're ingratiating yourself to someone. And it's the same thing with personal appeals. You're using some sort of you're building on the relationship you have with the other one, either as a way of praising them and flattering them, or to say, you know, you're my friend, I'm loyal to you, and I'm asking you to be loyal back so that we can do this together. And both of those tactics are fine. Sometimes that's what you need to do. I mean, a friend might be resistant at first when you give them the rational, logical approach, and then you say, hey, look, we've been friends for a long time. I trust you, and I trust your way of seeing these things, and I really believe in you, and I really think that you should do this. So you're ingratiating and using personal appeals in that context. And the goal here is you may use all of these or many of these in a conversation trying to persuade someone to follow suit. So how do you think about that? So when you're ready to go and influence someone to persuade them to do something, you don't, you know, just start at the bottom and then assume that they, you know, and keep repeating the same tactic. I'm going to just give you logic and assume that you're going to follow my logic. What you do is you start as, I'm going to start with this, and then I'm going to move to this, and then if that still doesn't work, you know, I'm going to use this last approach to see if I can influence them to do what I wanted to do. So you develop a plan of attack for how to convince someone, how to persuade them why your idea is right, why they need to make a particular decision, and why they need to move forward in the way that you recommend. Other influencing tactics are exchanges. For example, if you do this for me, I'll reciprocate and do this for you later. And it's, you know, a common negotiation. If you do this, I scratch your back, you scratch my back, we both win. We both kind of get what we want. And that's a basis for a lot of influence and negotiation tactics in organizations and in politics. Coalitions. And a coalition is where we get others who believe and agree with me, and the group of us put pressure on the individual to comply and to commit to doing things differently. And so coalitions can be really powerful, but I certainly would not recommend going right to the coalition and putting peer pressure on people, because that oftentimes can turn someone off. I know for myself, if I have a bunch of people coming up to me, no, you have to do this, the first response in my head is always, no, I don't. So just recognize your audience, know who it is that you're trying to influence, and know which tactics should work better with them than others. Legitimating tactics, basically where we have the right and authority to say, this is what we're going to do, and you will comply. And many times that is what we have to do, is we have to order someone to do something even if we don't like it. The same thing with the last one, pressure, using demands or threats to influence them. So constantly checking up on them, constantly going, are you ready to make a decision? Will you do this? Will you do this? And sometimes that works with some people where you put enough pressure on them where they say, fine, all right, I'll do it. Whereas for other people, again, that's like the big, shutdown, and they're not going to do it. And I used to have these conversations with my children all the time, when they would whine and they would want something, and they'd be like, but Mom, you have to do this. And I would turn around and go, at any point in time in your life, has whining got you what you wanted? Because now I'm definitely not going to do it at what you want, because that's not an acceptable way to talk to me. And so you can set the boundaries. I mean, if you don't want to respond to any of these types of influencing tactics, you should have a firm boundary around you about what is appropriate and what is not appropriate. It's like what they can do and what they shouldn't be doing, and in order to be able to be supportive. On this last slide, there's some broad comments about politics. Are politics really a bad thing? Politicking, I don't think, is bad. I think, these are ways of influencing people. And one of the influencing tactics we've talked about, right, is appealing to somebody or building coalitions. That's politicking. But organizational politics, basically, when you are trying to achieve your own self-interest and not the interests of the company, I think that is what's bad. So I think it's really important, if you're going to use influencing tactics, that you are abundantly clear that politics and your own self-interest are not acceptable, but influencing someone because it's the right thing to do for the organization, to make your case, to show how it will work, that makes sense. Do you need it to succeed in an organization? Yeah, you need influencing tactics. You need politicking skills. If you are not familiar with the politics and you assume, well, I'm just going to be a straight shooter, and if anybody doesn't like it, that's too bad. That's perfectly fine, and it's absolutely admirable. I think you just have to recognize that sometimes, people will not work with you if you're not willing to compromise on things, and sometimes in organizations you need to compromise. So it can be a barrier if you aren't willing to engage in different types of influencing tactics. I don't mean that as a bad way. I don't mean politicking in the term of engaging in your own self-interest. I want to be abundantly clear about that. But there are times when you're going to have to influence people. There are times you're going to have to compromise. There are times when you're going to have to say, yeah, I'm going to take a step back and not do that, because I think in the big picture that other person's idea is better, even if it hurts our ego and we don't want to agree to it. Fundamentally, that's what we need to do. When do politics become bad in an organizational setting? When it becomes me versus you, I'm right, you're wrong, and an unwillingness to work towards the betterment of the organization in the long run. And I think what we're seeing now in terms of political behaviors, and I don't mean politics like in Washington, D.C. politics, although it could certainly apply there. What I mean by political behavior is behavior that's engaged in your own self-interest. That's becoming a bigger problem, and perhaps partly because it's being modeled in Washington, D.C., right? The Democrats and the Republicans, both sides, engage in enormous political behaviors to try to influence because they believe they're right and the other side is wrong. There's no room for compromise. There's no room for dialogue. There's no room for talking and figuring out how we can make things work. And until we do that, yes, politicking, political behaviors will be bad. Influencing is not bad. Political behaviors are. So making sure you're clear about your intentions will really help, because if you can legitimate how what you want to do is connected to the mission and vision of the company, then you can at least demonstrate that you're not working in your own self-interest, you're working in the interest of the organization in general.